Yes, great. Am I audible? Can you
Yes,
hear? Yes.
I can hear
Okay.
you.
Okay, very nice. Well, welcome back to our symposium, Rethinking Kirchner and Nolde, which set itself the task to rethink the relationship between the art museum and the ethnological museum, and thus to explore and critique ways of assigning value and meaning to the objects kept and exhibited in these museums. Doing so also leads into questioning the boundaries drawn between art history and anthropology as academic disciplines, and to unpack and critique the ways in which the categories of art and ethnographic object have been employed to vest things with different meanings and values that in turn underpin a particular hierarchized image of the world. This kind of rethinking has been going on, of course, for quite some time with regard to and within the ethnological museums, where colonial legacies are obvious and impossible to overlook. And this entailed changes of name, for example, as World Museum, Museum of World Culture, and all that. However, with regard to art museums, these legacies are getting noticed more slowly, while concomitantly the turn to post-colonial issues in mainstream art history is also quite much more recent. I'm an anthropologist working on Africa, on Ghana, and a religious studies scholar. And I very much am into rethinking the premises that underpin how scholars in the humanities and social sciences produce knowledge about the world. And I want to contribute to raising critical awareness in broader society of how coloniality lingers on ill-remembered in so many domains. And for this reason, I enthusiastically participated in the advisory group for the Rethinking Kirchner and Nolde exhibition in the Stedelijk Museum, which I find timely, brave, and visionary. Yesterday, this exhibition was in the spotlight of our symposium, and we could see how productive and, in fact, long overdue a cooperation between curators and scholars from the Stedelijk and the National Museum for World Cultures is. Such a cooperation is needed to develop a broader, more adequate art history that situates Kirchner and Nolde in the political and cultural setting of their time, when the modern order was established with far-reaching, albeit all too easily overlooked, sidelined implications for the domain of modern art. And of course, I think one should also say that this is not simply an issue of complicity, as modern art also was a transformative, critical side of thinking otherwise. Nothing is simple, as the exhibition held by the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin, Neolithic Childhood, Art in a False Present, showed, I think, very well. Now, today, in this plenary, we pursue our inquiries into the relation between the ethnographic museum and the modern or contemporary art museum. This plenary title already provocatively evokes the idea of a changing social contract between both types of museums. And as I understand it, here social contract refers to partly implicit, partly explicit agreements about moral and political rules that underpin the division of labor between these museums and that place them always in a certain hierarchy, which, as we all agree, I think, became a dead end, hence the need to rethink. So what if it is the ethnographic museum that can showcase ways towards a broader, more inclusive, trans-regional take on art and aesthetics, thereby refusing to maintain the distinction between art and ethnographic objects and reimagining the relation between art history, visual culture, and anthropology? This distinction, after all, has long operated as a kind of smokescreen through which colonialism was rendered invisible, almost invisible, we could say, in the domain of art. Under what conditions can ethnographic museums, in all their new reinventions, of course, play that role? And can they at all? Three presentations in this plenary will focus on the renowned Oceania exhibition that was on in the Royal Academy, London, in the Musée du Quai Branly, and the Museum Volkenkunde, Leiden. importantly, and different from the Rethinking Nolde and Kirchner exhibition, it did not juxtapose Western and Pacific works, but sought to showcase Pacific art not as expressions of a traditional world untouched by Western influences, but as contextualized in, yet not reduced to British European imperial outrage. In fact, since Captain Cook, we could say. This exhibition also opened up many questions about the relation between the Ethnographic Museum and contemporary artists from Oceania. In this sense, the Oceania exhibition and the questions it raises by trying to involve contemporary artists is a fantastic case that can help us rethink the relation between art and ethnography and hopefully develop some new ideas for a new social contract. Next to the presentations regarding Oceania as exhibition, we will also hear the views of two artists, curators working with materials from Oceania. And so here we will now start with a presentation by Daniel Waswas. Daniel is a celebrated Papua New Guinean artist, an educator, and also the founder of the Center for Arts and Innovation at Papua New Guinea. And Daniel, I'm incredibly happy, even that there's such a big time lag and everything, that you were able to join us and kick off this plenary. And so I would like to, give you the screen. Yes.
Hello, Bijit. I'm sorry, I'm having problem. I cannot get the on this side. I cannot hear anything, but I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. The angle that I was more looking at. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for having me. I'm honored to participate. And I'd like to start off by looking at my journey as an artist in Papua New Guinea. And from Papua New Guinea, I went over to New Zealand and I spent a fair bit of time in New Zealand. And from what I learned with the interaction between the other oceanic artists, people like Michael Taffrey, John Pule, Fatu Fehu, those are Polynesian heritage who are based out of Auckland, New Zealand, and they've been pushing the boundaries of contemporary Pacific art, all germinating out of Auckland, and that gave me a lot of something that I can add value. And after spending my time in New Zealand, I decided to return to Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, to work for the University of Papua New Guinea. And so I worked as the, I was appointed the director of the art school at the University of Papua New Guinea. And what I realized at the art school was the system was, I have no idea who designed the system, but it was more leaning towards academia. And it was governed by the grade point average system of entry. And what I saw was, and from my experience back in New Zealand, the Maori artists and the Pacific artists were given the option of pursuing academia field and also practice-based. And that's exactly what I wanted to do at the University of Papua New Guinea, but I was not allowed to do it. I wasn't given the room to look at artists of what. In fact, I haven't heard of, the artists of people like Paul Gauguin, who spent a lot of time in Tahiti, and Nolde, who came into mostly East New Britain and New Ireland. And the relationship and how can we have that connection with the other artists at the University of Papua New Guinea, you could not relay those messages to the students in a clear fashion simply because of the high school level to enter the university. There's a bigger gap in Papua New Guinea. So when they entered the university, you could see that what you wanted to teach was not there. The academic field, they were not prepared for the art and the relationship between artists and also the like looking at other Western art or the movements that was happening in Europe or even within the Pacific as a whole. So art practice in Papua New Guinea, what I saw at the art school was quite very limited. So that's why I wanted to create two pathways for practice-based in academia. And unfortunately, I wasn't supported, so I had to resign, and I left about 7 years ago. And from there, that's where the birth of the Center for Arts and Innovation came about. And you may be wondering how I got those funding and to pursue this passion. It's been a very laborious journey. So I had to do a lot of art exhibitions, travel, and asking sponsors, going to the banks, simply focusing more on the sustainable art education. And as I went along doing that practice, I raised capital. And we were fortunate enough to buy a piece of land. And we started off one thing at a time. It's now almost 8 years work in progress with the center. And finally, just about a couple of months ago, we finished off our gallery space. And we did a trial run at the art center to bring in students. And the interest was overwhelming. We had about 160 young people showing up at our gate, wanting to learn practice-based approach. And what I was looking at was with the availability of technology now, I was trying to look at it from how can we access all the art forms that are available within Australia, New Zealand, within the Oceania region to start off, and how can the students have access to a communal platform where they can come and learn and see the different art forms that are available in other museums around the world, as well as within the Oceania region. And that's when, with our gallery, we are more looking at setting up a Zoom system within that facility that now you're looking at. So these are some of the artworks now. The sculptures are by Gigmai Kundun. He's one of Papua New Guinea's top, leading sculptor, and Dr. Nicholas Garnier, which I understand has contributed to the study for Nolde and Kirchner, and also Dr. Mel. So Gigmai Kundun has been working with Dr. Nicholas Garnier for quite a long time before Nicholas left Papua New Guinea and came back, got a job at the Kubran Lee. So from the passion that I have, I'd like to use the art as a means of communication to reach as many people as I can, because the younger population in Papua New Guinea, there are quite a lot of young population now at the moment who have the skills, but they cannot enter the university simply because of the grade point average system. You have to meet the criteria to enter the university, and that is creating a filtering system whereby very talented artists have been not allowed to enter the university. So my passion here now with the Art Center, if we get into the virtual world, as well as having access to artworks that are in museums around the world, but they can see it in real time in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, and at the same time, give them that opportunity to also practice in a space where they can add value to the community that they're in, addressing social issues. Mostly females are quite marginalized, and that's where my passion is. How can we help the females to upskill them? And that is the journey that I am now pursuing, and I am working closely with some of my old professors out of Australia and New Zealand to go into the virtual platform so they can teach in their comfort zone wherever they are, and they can pass on the skills back into Port Moresby without traveling. So that is the plan I have going forward. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Daniel. This is a very, very intriguing and important project. And I'm very happy that you shared it with us. I'm not sure you can hear me, but I just want to highlight for all of us
Sorry,
that
sorry, I can hear you. That's one of the problem I'm facing here.
Yeah.
Sorry, my apologies.
Yeah. That is okay. So I think this is very, very important and interesting. It is really a great initiative, which also shows in a way the whole issue concerning the idea to be more inclusive concerning art in museums by looking at taking us to the problems that occur at the ground. So thank you very, very much for this. I think that the PowerPoint is shown from the RCMC. Okay, so I just wondered whether we had seen all the images, and I guess that we have reached the end of the PowerPoint. So many, many thanks again. I hope that for the discussion, Alessandra can employ the phone again so that it will be possible to also make you hear the questions. But we should also put things into the chat, Daniel.
Yeah,
Thanks
Daniel,
a lot.
I'll call you on your WhatsApp and then you can listen through your WhatsApp.
Okay. Yes? Okay, thanks a lot. This was a wonderful kickoff. And I would now like to give the screen to Nicholas Thomas. Nick Thomas is professor of historical anthropology and director of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Cambridge. And he was also the co-curator of the Oceania exhibition, which we see already spotlighted here. So please, Nick, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Birgit and everybody. The first thing I wanted to say about Oceania is that it was nothing if not a deep collaboration. Peter Brunt and I worked with Adrian Locke at the Royal Academy, but actually with many, many other people across the RA, across other institutions, the institutions that supported us through loans, and also, of course, a lot of people in the Pacific, artists, old friends, people who helped us understand works. I wanted to start with a sort of a tangent that's relevant to the Kirkner-Nolde context of this discussion. The exhibition had a couple of precursors that didn't happen. For about 10 years, I was working on Oceania exhibitions in Canberra and London that failed, that were cancelled for various reasons. And the only reason I want to mention those projects now is that the goal in that context was to foreground colonial confrontation and encounter by juxtaposing works not from the sort of classic modernist primitivist ground, but because they emerged from specific places and times, from colonial encounters. In some cases, these works shared space and time. In a sense, the obvious conclusion is that very different cultural regimes, different ontologies, different societies were encountering each other, but there were also in some ways quite remarkable points of convergence. The great Maori sculptor of the colonial period, Tene Waitiri, produces these sort of neo-traditional walking sticks. Gauguin too produces walking sticks with a kind of his version of Polynesian sculpture. So that's a kind of, I want to allude to that strategy, even though it was not one that we pursued in Oceania itself. I'm sorry, I'm sort of having some trouble with the slides jumping around. One of the contexts of the project was a big collaborative book that we worked on from about, I think, 2006 to until when it was published. that drove a lot of the thinking, thinking oceanic art historically, thinking encounter, thinking colonialism and modernity in oceanic art. We were very fortunate also to win a major European research grant that enabled a lot of research in European collections, a lot of encounter actually with artists. Second from the left is Teiki Huakena from the Marquesas, together with other colleagues on that project. There was a sort of sustained process of looking at collections, sharing ideas and responses to objects, discovering things, conversation. I won't say much. That project had many dimensions, field work in various places, investigations into objects. When the exhibition project was launched, we were fortunate to attract the support and engagement of a significant group of scholars, cultural leaders from various Pacific nations. That's them meeting in London. The RA was coming up to its 250th anniversary. Our exhibition wasn't about Cook, but the remarkable coincidence was that 2018 was also the 250th anniversary of the departure of the Endeavour from England on Cook's first Pacific voyage. So we had that opportunity to tie into that very significant anniversary. We worked on the exhibition from more or less 2012-13 up to 2018 when it opened. We had a strong sense early on that three core themes were voyaging, meaning the human settlement of the Pacific, but also exchange, trade, interaction, forced migration, a dynamic across water that marked the whole history of the Pacific, and in many senses gave it its identity as a region, as a sphere of cultural interaction, and an idea, very fundamentally an idea for prominent indigenous intellectuals like Apeli Hauofa and many others of the last 30 to 40 years. So a core theme was voyaging. A second core theme was placemaking, which was about people creating environments through architecture, through religion, through genealogy, through ancestors. And our third major theme was encounter. So this was an exhibition that really sought to foreground historical interaction, the Pacific as a space of colonial modernity via Christianity, all sorts of historic engagements with various colonial actors, and colonial confrontation and violence. So that large object right across the lower part of the display there is a ceremonial food trough, clearly an innovative genre, a piece made on a large scale in the late 19th century that features warriors with pistols and so on, as well as the customary headhunting imagery of the period. That piece was looted in the 1880s by a British naval expedition. In general, we avoided showing objects that, including or showing objects that were illegitimately appropriated, but we did want to foreground them in the case of that history. Contemporary work was crucial to the exhibition. We wanted to create a realm of debate. It wasn't just about Peter and myself or other experts talking about pieces. It was about creating a space in which artists offered their own commentaries on culture, identity, history, place, and related themes. It was also an ambitious exhibition, I think, art historically, because we wanted to reveal genres of oceanic art, like work on paper that were, you know, less familiar for people who assume it's all figure sculpture or sculptures of gods or whatever, or weapons. So that work was important to the project. A significant range of contemporary Indigenous works. It also mattered to us that the exhibition was inhabited. Michael Parakofai's piano was played. People could sign up, and it was played more or less through the duration of the exhibition, which was sort of very positively very busy a lot of the time. It was also important to us that the exhibition was inhabited by islanders, and we were fortunate that there were significant groups of people that came to the opening that celebrated the project. But there were also members of the diaspora in London, activists in some cases, who left offerings in the gallery, and at an early point, the RA staff agreed with us that it was important for those offerings to stay there through the duration of the exhibition. So there were stone and plant offerings around a number of works. The Solomon Islands flag was placed in relation to that looted object towards the end of the exhibition, but that remained there until we closed. We were pleased that the exhibition was well received. And I think it's worth just saying that I think we were very much aware that we were curating something for a London audience, for the kind of cosmopolitan art audience that you get in London. That's a sophisticated audience in one sense, but an audience that's not well informed at all about the Pacific. Some criticism focused on questions of colonial violence, dispossession. Had we downplayed that? Was it too celebratory an exhibition? My own feeling was that we did cite that issue. We acknowledged the issue. Had we put greater emphasis on colonial violence, my concern, I think, in hindsight anyway, is that the responses would have been, you know, these were great cultures, great traditions in the past that colonialism destroyed. And I think we really wanted to include the work from the present to sort of foreground the ongoing dynamism of Pacific art and culture, the fact that we were engaging with living and powerful traditions in the present, contemporary issues, climate change, sea level rise, migration, resource extraction. And I could imagine us having sort of missed the mark if the show had been interpreted differently. I think I just want to signal a couple of consequences or legacies. The Cook commemoration was significant in New Zealand in clearly awkward terms, but there was a long-standing goal that these paddles collected by Cook in New Zealand together with others went out to the local museum at the site of that encounter in Gisborne. It wasn't just an ordinary exhibition loan. The pieces went first to the local marae. People handled them and performed with them. There were also opportunities for community study sessions before they went on exhibition, where they still are. There's been a parallel discussion about this very important piece from Tahiti at the time of the Kay Bronley exhibition. It was really good to be able to talk to Hero Moana, the minister, and the director of Miriama, the director of the museum in Tahiti. And that piece and others will go on an extended loan from next year. I was sort of finally thinking about how that project related to other landmark exhibitions that in some sense or another were connected. Te Maori was massively important in the early 1980s, very much about Maori people claiming the work, claiming the exhibition, having the authority to speak for the heritage. I mean, of course, we can't imagine now that it would ever be otherwise. It was also absolutely an affirmation of culture and tradition. I think what Oceania was trying to do that was probably fundamentally different was to represent work in history as expressions of local engagement and action in a space of global colonial history as well as art history. And of course, this was the most debated exhibition of the last part of the 20th century. And I think what we tried to do that was profoundly different to this was to locate dynamism and agency on multiple sides of these encounters, and to move to a context where the art of Oceania and contemporary artists of Oceania were not only representing their own cultures and histories, but offering powerful commentaries on empire and indeed on Europe. In a sense, this was an exhibition about Europe and about European science, knowledge, and art. Even though we did all of that, we tried to do all of that story via the works of oceanic artists. I think I should stop there.
Thank you, Nick. This has been a really amazing presentation. I think it is very helpful that you also situate your concerns in relation to the Nolde Kirchner exhibition, as well as to the earlier primitivism exhibition, which can also help us to situate it better. Thanks a lot. I'm very sorry personally that I have not seen it. I really feel very, very bad about that since I started to read around it and now also heard you about it. Well, our next speaker now is Stéphanie Leclerc-Caffarel. She is a curator of the Pacific collections at the Musée du Quai Branly, Jacques Chirac in Paris, and she was the curator of the Océanie exhibition there, which in a way was very strongly related to the Oceania exhibition in the Royal Academy, yet of course also had to be adapted in a way to the different local circumstances. So please, Stéphanie, you have the floor.
Thank you, Birgit. Thank you, Nick and everybody. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and to everybody for a very, very interesting symposium so far. Yes, so it was actually the same exhibition. I was acting like the local curator in Branly, and I'll come back to that. I was very lucky to end up with that challenge. When I actually just arrived at the Quai Branly, when the Oceania opened in London in September 2018, I just started working at the Quai Branly. So in fact, I came in very late in the process. All the works of art have already been selected, and they included many masterpieces that I had learned about when I was studying art history, museology, and anthropology, which was very exciting and terrifying at the same time. And the catalog was ready. It had already been translated. So I did not take part in all of that. This was mostly Nick and Peter, with whom I worked in dialogue. But my task really was to make sure that the exhibition would be presented in a way that would be as relevant as possible in the 2019 Brownlee context, which was in fact, for many reasons, quite different from the Royal Academy context just a few months before. Of course, there was the regular adapting to do. The spaces were very different. The Royal Academy is a historical building, and Brownlee is a modern building, and the Garden Gallery is a very flexible space that's about the opposite of the Royal Academy. It has no definite rooms. It has a rather low ceiling, as you can see on the left. And we wanted to embrace that space rather than trying to replicate the Royal Academy show, which had encountered a big success. It was also very different because the Royal Academy, Nick mentioned it, the exhibition happened, coincided with a double anniversary, the 250 years after the Royal Academy had opened and 250 years after Cook's first voyage departed for the Pacific. But in Brownlee, we also had a very important historical turning point. Only after 12 years of opening and many, many debates about the identity and the purpose of the Brownlee Museum, we had in a way reached a turning point in the history of the institution already, especially following on from the publication of the report on the restitution of African and cultural heritage, published by Felwine Sarr and Benedict Savoy, which subtitle I actually like a lot, which is Toward a New Relational Ethics. And the publication of that report really accelerated the examen de conscience, the examination of conscience, to use the words of Emmanuel Casarero, who is the current director of the museum. That examination of conscience was already happening, but it was not formalized, not verbalized in the same way that it is now. And so it was a very interesting moment to welcome the Oceania exhibition in Brownlee, because it provided us with an opportunity to publicly articulate some of those key debates that were kind of buzzing around us. So we worked on making sure that some key elements of the show that the show provided already were highlighted so that they could perhaps resonate with the French audience and its expectations as much as possible, and also with the mission of the museum, which is to foster cross-cultural dialogues. And actually, when I did not move moved on the PowerPoint. When I was thinking about the topic of this panel, which is the title is on changing the social contract of the museum and thinking about the relationship of the ethnographic and the art museum, I realized that maybe I had to come back a little bit on the history of the Quai Branly Museum. As you may know, the Musée du Quai Branly inherited two collections and collections that previously belonged to two very specific museums. The first was, and it still exists, of course, the Musée de l'Homme, or the Museum of Man, which itself was a reformulation, a reframing of the ethnographic museum that had existed in the Trocadero Hill, on the Trocadero Hill before its. And the second museum that had collections from Africa and Oceania that ended up in the Musée du Quai Branly was the National Museum of African and Oceanic Art. And that museum was, in fact, an evolution of the Colonial Museum that was born after the Colonial exhibition in Paris in 1931. And this is for that Colonial exhibition that the building that you see and the building that used to house the National Museum of African and Oceanic Art was created, which explains the decor. And today that museum is, that building shelters the Museum of the Immigration, which is interesting enough. And so what I wanted to say is that, in fact, from the beginning, from the start, the Musée du Quai Branly was neither an ethnographic nor exactly an art museum, but really had the ambition to create a dialogue between the two. And one way it has done that from the start was through exhibitions that showed, presented contemporary art practice from other parts of the world. And I'm just giving you a few examples, old and recent. We also had quite a lot of exhibitions that explicitly aimed at setting back artwork in their historical context of production. So just a few examples again. So what I wanted to say is that even though the Musée du Quai Branly's idea clearly stems from the desire of President Jacques Chirac to build a national museum dedicated to tribal art, it was something else from the start, more than that from the start. As an institution that has tried and is still trying to escape restrictive and historically loaded categories. And this is maybe even more important now that under the leadership of Emmanuel Cazayrou, we are actively trying to include more voices and to challenge the idea that the authority and the expertise on non-European art would be uniquely detained by the museum. I have to take the time. I lost the time. Okay, yeah, tell me.
Have 5 minutes, plenty of time. Just go on. Okay. It's very exciting.
Yeah, so I don't know how far I can go. Maybe I'll just keep the exhibition part to talk about the reception of the exhibition in Paris, because that's very interesting. But I wanted to tell you also a little bit about the cultural landscape of Parisian museum in which the Quai Branly had to find its space. And that Parisian landscape is really structured around 3 national museums. And the chronological division is very interesting, because the Louvre is, of course, a kind of encyclopedic museum in a way that welcomes works of art, including non-European works of art, if we count Egyptian archaeology and Muslim art, for example. But that predates 1848. And then Orsay, which you have on the top right, is an art museum and welcomes works of art produced between 1848 and 1915. And the Centre Pompidou, the Museum of Contemporary and Modern Art, shelters art produced after 1915. And then we have other museums, such as the Musée Guinea, which is dedicated to Asian art, that are more thought about as specialized museums that focus on one area or one artist, if we think about the Picasso Museum, for example. And somehow the Quai Branly falls in that category of museum, which is very interesting in many ways, but as a big creates a big problem is that it kind of erases the chronological parameter. And the Quai Branly gathers archaeological items as well as contemporary artwork. But I think that most of our visitors still forget that many of these artwork, and Nick mentioned that yesterday talking about Malangan art as contemporary art, many of those items, if they were European art, would be in Orsay or in Pompidou rather than in the Louvre. So that's an interesting thing. And what I wanted to say, but I'm not going to go into detail here, is that we tried, without thinking in terms of linear chronology, which would have been very ethnocentric, and which Nick and Peter really actively deconstructed. We did try to highlight the chronological parameter in Oceania in Branly. So I'm going to go very fast. I'm so sorry. I just wanted to talk about the reception of the show a little bit. I was going to say that we concentrated quite a few contemporary artwork toward the end of the exhibition, but for a reason that we can discuss later in the discussion if you want to know more about this. Same, I wanted to talk about all the voices that and the way we did that. We did try to include in the exhibition Pacific voices. But let's just say a few words about the reception of the exhibition. Yeah, and of course, we did not have that one, which would have allowed us to talk about colonial violence in a different way. Interestingly enough, the reception of the exhibition was overwhelmingly good, if we speak generally. But we received a few criticism, and those really interest me. One criticism that's really important for me came from the people from Uvea and Futuna, which is French territory in the Pacific. And Uvean communities especially really expressed their regret to not be represented in the exhibition. So that was a very interesting, very important feedback for us. Another recurring comment that really surprised me and that we kept finding in the press and in the guest book was that the exhibition was somehow hypersexualized, that you could see a lot of nudity and evocation of sexual intercourse and things like that. People were especially shocked for some reason by the moving images in Lisa Rayana's installation, which many deemed not appropriate to children. And that was a recurring comment in the guest book. And at the same time, they really did not seem to notice the sexual violence that was depicted on the painted beam from the Bao house from Palau, which had me quite worried because it was the first work of art that the visitor encountered when it entered the main room of the exhibition. And all of this really had me wonder if similar subject, which is nude bodies and colonial violence, had been depicted in actually similar media, paintings, sculptures, and videos in the Louvre or including in the Egyptian section, or in Orsay or in Pompidou. Would the critics have been the same? And I suspect they would not have. So this is what I wanted to bring forward today. And I was preparing this, I was reading the book by Daniel Sherman on French primitivism. And it made me think about primitivism as a kind of ongoing category and preconceived commentary on non-European art that our visitors, despite all our efforts, still seem to have. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Stephanie. There was not even such a need to rush. I think the presentation was also very exciting and taking us along. And I think what we already see that it is very important to have a clear idea about the context in which even so-called traveling exhibitions are being situated. And I think you sketched very well how, in fact, the Musée du Quai Branly that hosted this exhibition, in a way, takes some distance from its past as an ethnological museum. It may be the question whether the audiences do go along with that, of course. And that it also hosted that exhibition, well, of course, always in a way that raises questions about the big others, like the Louvre and the others you mentioned. So I think that would be something very interesting for our discussion. I also found it very interesting that you highlighted as an important context for this exhibition, the Sarre-Savoie report about restitution, which of course indeed brings other perspectives and other political concerns also into the debates. I find it interesting that given the differences between the two sites, London and Paris, that you both said so far that the exhibition was largely welcomed and seen as very positive. That is definitely something I think that we could go into a bit deeper, also against the background of the criticisms our exhibition here at the Stedelijk received. So it seems that the framing of the museum and how it is seen does matter also in its possibility to show, and does also matter in relation to the responses. Anyhow, we now move to the presentation by Vonu Weiss, and Vonu is a curator here at the Tropen Museum, the National Museum of World Cultures. She also was in the advisory board of the Kirchner Nolde exhibition, and she curated A Sea of Islands, masterpieces from Oceania, here in Leiden, and this exhibition was very strongly inspired by the Oceania, Oceanu exhibition, but could not in a way take it over and adapt it in a simple way. And so now Vonu will take the floor and tell us about it. So please, Vonu.
Thank you. First, there will be a video to give you very, very brief overview of the exhibition. Because also the exhibition started just before the lockdown, so very few people actually had the opportunity to see it. So that's just to give you an overview. Thank you. So I will now share my screen. Okay.
But Vonu,
yes.
we don't see you. We see a green screen, and we don't see you.
Sorry.
Now it's okay.
Here I am.
Okay, very good, very good.
Sorry. So this exhibition is A Sea of Islands, is of course has a clear relationship to the Oceania, Océanie exhibition, and it came about because my colleagues and I visited the Oceania show. We realized that actually quite a lot of objects in that show, in both the shows, came from our collection. We also had, I think we were the second biggest lender after Cambridge. So my colleagues also realized that perhaps we had a really good collection actually from the Pacific. And so it was decided to try and set up our own Pacific exhibition. Initially, we wanted to kind of adapt it to our location, to a smaller space. But because of contracts and so on, that was really difficult. So we really had to create our own exhibition that was kind of contractually removed from the Oceania and Oceanie exhibition, but conceptually is very related, because we talked extensively with Nicholas Thomas and with Peter Brunt as well. And they were really very helpful in kind of reshaping and keeping it to some of the core themes that Nicholas also mentioned in his presentation. And so we also wanted to adapt it to our own audiences, so which is a Dutch audience, which also has different, especially colonial links to the Pacific. And we wanted to draw that out as well. So this is just to give you an idea of the exhibition space. In this talk, I'm not going to talk much about the objects that you could see in the exhibition, but I'm going to focus on the interplay between the contemporary art and the so-called ethnographic art, and how we played or how we confronted these art objects with each other. And what you see here on the screen is just the where contemporary art was placed throughout the exhibition. You see we have a kind of a strange layout with a really long corridor, which often makes it a bit difficult to exhibit objects. But we had almost in every space, we had contemporary art. So that was what you saw in the exhibition. So the visitor entered in the space that was thought about conceptually as the kind of the connection with water, with voyaging, like Nick explained as well. And so in that part, we worked with quotes. We didn't work with like calling the spaces while giving them a name, saying this is about water, this is about voyaging, this is about encounters. But we try to let people from the Pacific, thinkers from the Pacific, scholars from the Pacific, talk in their own words. And so these are just a few of the quotes that relate to the spaces that talk about voyaging and that talk about conceptually about water and the importance of the sea. In that space, we had the video work by Kathy Jetnell-Kijner, Tell Them, which relates and talks about the importance of the sea, but also about the current dangers and challenging related to climate change and related to nuclear waste and nuclear testing that has happened in that area. We also had the work of George Nuku, which was really the work that in the space that talked about conceptually about the importance of water throughout the whole Pacific region. And the work by George Nuku, Bottled Ocean 2120, was also an example of a collaborative work. There were 200 volunteers that worked together with George Nuku in creating this artwork. It went from cleaning bottles to, well, collecting bottles as well, cleaning them, but then also setting up the whole structure, drilling holes, sewing together pieces. So it was really a great collaborative work. And so in that way, it also engaged with the local Dutch community, which relates also to the theme of the social contract of the museum and but I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, how we as a museum conceive or see ourselves and our mission in society. We also had the work of by Mark Adams, which related to the way people, to what Nicholas also mentioned, to the placemaking and how people create environments for themselves. Here, Mark Adams noticed that in New Zealand, there was a great need for people to assert, Samoan people living in New Zealand, to assert themselves and to create their own kind of space in New Zealand. And some of them do it by the way of tattooing and keeping that tradition alive. We also had, so creating space we don't really have artwork, contemporary artwork relating to that, but we also use the quotes, and we had, of course, the historical artwork that relates to this creating of space. We had the work about how ancestors and generations are being treated and looked upon. And so we have this great work by Taloi Havini and Stuart Miller, which is part of a series of photographs, the Blood Generation series, which talks about people who were born during the time of civil war in Bougainville, which was also a time of when there was a lot of strife about resources and mining that happened. And so those people were born in that really difficult time of unrest and are often referred to as the Blood Generation. We had the work by Yuki Kihara, which interplayed with the kind of the objects that talked about the colonial encounter as well. And this work also plays with this idea of colonial encounter, because you see Yuki Kihara here wearing a very kind of typical colonial dress, but performing it's a video work, performing a Samoan tawalunga, a traditional dance. And that was also related to contemporary issues of a hurricane that killed a lot of people in Samoa. And then we have seen images of the work by Lisa Rehana, which really clearly talks about this colonial encounter, and which also related to these objects that testify to this colonial encounter. And the work by Fiona Partington, it's quite interesting to note that we chose to not to show, because it also deals with ancestors, with generations, and with difficult histories. And we chose to show this work separate from, for example, the space where Taloi Havini's work was, and also the space where the altar, the ancestral altar was, and other objects dealing with ancestors and death, because we didn't want to have this immediate confrontation between ancestral remains and work by a Polynesian artist, by a New Zealand artist, because we realized there was a great discomfort, especially from Polynesian people, in having their work immediately confronted with ancestral remains. And so the museum responsibilities and how we see this, or how we interpreted this social contract, we try to take into account our audiences, our stakeholders, and also the indigenous communities who were involved and who informed also this exhibition. So we have in the Netherlands, I think in general, but in our museum as well, we have a great or an important tradition of having these children's roots. And in the past, our museums, for example, the Trough Museum Junior has received prizes actually for how we deal with children and how children can find their way through the museum. So one of these elements was an interactive wall, which showed in pictorial, just pictorially, addressed some of the themes that were that you could find throughout the exhibition. So sometimes it were objects that were explained in a pictorial way, so you could touch the wall and then a story would unfold. Sometimes it was like bigger themes, such as climate change, such as mining, such as just more popular culture themes, such as bungee jumping, for example. So that on several levels, people could relate to these specific themes that like Nick already said as well, also in the Netherlands, there is sometimes people are not necessarily that well informed about themes that relate to the Pacific and to Pacific art more specifically. So we wanted to find a kind of an easy way in to trigger people's attention. Also, the exhibition was conceived of as an art exhibition. So the subtitle was Masterpieces from Oceania. And so it was also aimed at this audience that would be triggered by aesthetic qualities of the objects, but would like to know more and delve deeper into the actual themes and contents of what these and the stories these objects can tell. The exhibition, like I said before, we have this long corridor, and we conceived of this corridor as the kind of backbone of the exhibition, where we addressed some of the kind of more overarching themes, some aspects of popular culture, importance of performance, for example, dance, also the importance of tattooing, meaning of tattooing, things like really popular culture like surfing, bungee jumping, and how that relates to the kind of more historical artwork that people could see. And so people would go through the backbone and then back into the rooms where they were confronted with both historical objects, but also contemporary visions on these broader themes. And because the exhibition, we wanted to make it a kind of complete experience. So when the people went upstairs, there's the permanent gallery of the permanent Oceania gallery. And so we just tried to make that a complete experience. So people would go upstairs, would have the Oceania gallery, and then could walk through the long backbone again. So here, this backbone, and we featured work by two artists, photographers, Dutch photographers, and they dealt with some of the more sensitive issues, which we felt were really important to feature in our museum because we are a Dutch museum. And so those elements were the Papua and West Papua. Taco van der Ep had made photographs about the refugees who are in PNG, in Papua New Guinea, who come from Papua and West Papua, to highlight the difficult situation and the implication of the Netherlands with Papua and West Papua, and also with and also with our collections as well, because a large part of our collections in the museum originates from that part of the world. So the relationship with Indonesia, with West Papua, and with the Netherlands was highlighted in that way. And then we also had Esther Kokmeijer, who has worked with Marshall Islanders, and who has highlights in that way the issue of climate change, and who also works with local people, with Dutch scientists, and her take on it as an artist. So this was my presentation. Just these last slides show some of we had a blessing, and shows some of the kind of involvement of very different communities or stakeholders, you can call them. So we have people from the Njord Rowing Club who are very heavily involved with our museum through the waka, through the canoe, Maori canoe that we hold in the museum. And then we also have the Papuan communities who were directly involved. And we had Ngati Ranana and George Nuku also involved in the blessing of the exhibition. Unfortunately, we opened on the 20th of February. That's not unfortunate, but we opened on the 20th of February last year. And 3 weeks later, we went into lockdown. then the exhibition reopened and was actually advertised as a must-see exhibition after the lockdown. But then it was open for a couple of months, and then the lockdown started again and actually never really reopened until the closure on the 5th of April this year. So thank you.
Thank you, Vono, for a wonderful presentation. And I feel even more sorry that it could not attract, due to COVID, the audiences it would definitely have deserved. I found it very interesting how you said that by giving out loans, you realized how much stuff you had and how much the collections are also grounded in, of course, Dutch colonial history in this region. So I think that might be also an interesting point for comparison among the three. I also found it very interesting that you highlighted quite extensively the participation of stakeholders. It seemed that we also had in Stephanie's and also in Nick's presentation. And I would be also, being a scholar in the field of religion as well, would also be very much interested in the ways in which the museums, you and your in this exhibition, did not only accommodate art, contemporary art, which is I find very interesting, but also accommodate its sacrality, as it were. So which also blows up in a way boundaries that from a modernist perspective might be drawn between art and religion. So I think there's a lot to look at here, to investigate. But we still have one presentation now, and this presentation will be by Narelle Jubelin. She's an Australian artist who has lived in Madrid for a long time. And currently she is working on a future exhibition, which she is co-curating at the Musée Etnologie i de Cultures del Món at Barcelona, together with artists from the TV Islands and with cultural leader and artist Pedro Vunea Miri. And please, Narelle, I would like to give you the floor. And I see you are there. Great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I feel like as we're talking about the Tiwi Islands, it's not quite Oceania. So I'll look for a way to make a link at some point. Because I never know where the direction of a conversation might go, I would like to advise if there are Indigenous Australian, Aboriginal Australian or Torres Strait Islanders watching, there may be mention of people that have passed or voice or their name. And hello. Okay, I'm going to talk about a residency that I was, I should share my pantalla. I was invited almost by default to do a residency in the Ethnological Museum in Barcelona in a project that involved a conjunto there of ethnographic or world culture museums at the end of last year. And when I say by default, I would have naturally encouraged them, and they would have been doing the same, to invite Indigenous artists that could have contact with the very significant collection of Australian and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander work that's held in a very unknown. It's been a really interesting process to see the two collections that actually merged, that were collected in the late 60s, early 70s. I was very lucky to have a way in to accept the invitation. I didn't know that the residency was going to happen until a week before I began. And at that point, I didn't really know what constituted the exhibition or the collection. I have had a very long friendship with Diana Wood Conroy, who was one of the first non-Indigenous women to go to the Tiwi Islands to work as a coordinator with one of the earliest arts centres. When we talk about art centres in Indigenous Australia, they are really the centres of
Narelle,
Yeah?
may I just interrupt? I see a message in the chat that it is not possible to see a PowerPoint or something, or only the screen. But what we see is correct, right? Do you all?
I think so. What
Yeah.
I'll do is open this.
Okay, but this is correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's good.
Just to make sure that everything technically
you.
works.
I'm not
Sorry
gonna
for
read-
interrupting.
I'm not going to read the chat, so the glasses thing. Anyway, I began the residency under the pressure of COVID. We didn't know until the very last minute if it would be possible for me to go from Madrid to Barcelona. It was. In the end, the residency was like contracted because of the second confinement. What I'm going to show you is I sort of hit the road running in terms of getting my head around what was held in the collection, and was very grateful for long distance support by Diana Wood Conroy, who guided me through the beginning of the investigation of the Tiwi cultural material, which is where I decided to concentrate. There was a large exhibition of Australian bark paintings that was under development at the time, that opens later this year. And so it made sense to concentrate on barks. One of the first conversations I had with Diana through her interlocutores in Tiwi Designs was that often the bark of the painting is referred to as skin. So I decided that I would enter documenting as much as I could to make contact between the objects in the collection with one of the source communities on the Tiwi Islands. Most of the collection were from Melville Island, where there's a very important art centre, Jilamara. Jilamara actually means design, or where many of the works and the origins of the designs come from body painting. What I'm going to show you here is what I call close looking. No, I was given unimpeded access to the collection, and I decided to film with the phone because it was a way that I could get the information through digital means into the communities. This is an object that I'd never seen before. It's a tunga, which is a stringy bark basket that has been painted on both sides. I began from a total exhilaration at seeing this object through interlocutores, artists that I know that have worked with community, but also curators. For example, Brooke Andrew, I called Brooke to ask who I should talk to, who was working with material on Melville Island that I could reach out to. He suggested straight away Pedro Wanayaramidi, who is now co-curating with me. The process has been a privilege to develop, and the conversations that we have developed since late last year have been, actually I had to sort of coax them into being interested in showing in an ethnographic museum. We'll be working in the beginning of next year. The exhibition is still very much in development. It's as yet untitled, but we're onto it. When I was asked to speak in this conference, it was based on a conference a couple of weeks ago in Barcelona. Pedro was unable to participate in this Zoom, but I said to him, I need to get your voice in there. So he's given me permission to screen this piece, which is not so much an artwork, but it's developing the conversations that we have under development. He was invited to or nominated for a very important prize in Darwin last year. Because of COVID, he was unable to attend, or he was going to do a performance during the opening. He has, what you're about to see is what he needed to do again by not being able to attend in person. They filmed him on site, on country, and this is what was produced to show the judges of the prize. It's funny having, I can probably take it off. It's not letting me take the bar off. So please meet Pedro. Pedro is performing on country. The work that he's doing in terms of he and his community are doing in terms of the consolidation and reiteration of dance is very important. He was awarded the prize for the Telstra Multimedia Prize in this occasion. I want to cite, he spoke with Brooke Andrew, curator, artist that he's worked with in the past. They are also developing for 2022 an exhibition where they're featuring this fabulous new piece that has just been published with Jilamara as producers, where 29 artists that work with the Arts Centre have performed on country. They call the piece Yogi, which means dance, ceremonial dance, and I'd like to cite what they say. Yogi is the name for ceremonial song and dance that is central to Tiwi culture in Northern Australia. It is indicative of repair, with the practice being passed down through generations. The gestures, calls, ceremonial objects, and body paint that comprise Yogi make up one of the strongest living creative practices, which seeks to constantly repair. Wania Ramirez's work draws on performance using film to bring dance, language, and vision of country into the institution. as well as framing and experience of Jilamata artists, ochre paintings, ironwood carvings, and screened fabrics. Yogi in this context expresses self-control, keeping the Tiwi culture close and controlling the dissemination of their own images rather than being represented by outside people. I could leave us there, no, because I think discussion will flourish after the density of material that we've been listening to. Or I could show a little bit of another piece. So I need to be led time-wise.
You have about 3 minutes, so you can still use that.
I think we'll leave it because, yeah, I think we'll leave it. There's such a density of what we've been talking about this far. Like visually, I'm actually exhausted. No, the visual richness of the exhibitions, and the I should have said actually, sorry, Pedro, the dance or the performance was Brolga, and I can actually make it. Brolga is a gregarious wetland bird common to the north of Australia, to the Tiwi Islands and to Papua New Guinea. So I can use a bird to link us into the oceanic region. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. That's great, Narelle. I cannot make myself visible. I don't know. Oh yeah, now it works. Okay, so thanks a lot. I found it very, very important. Interesting that Daniel, as an artist and someone running a new arts and innovation initiative, started the panel, and that you ended, as it were, also in a way sharing with us the perspective of an artist curator. Yesterday also you said you see yourself also as some kind of research assistant who is up in a way for developing a new kind of exhibition. And this is definitely a very, very important thread, of course, through this plenary. So the way in which art can be included in a way that will also criticize narrow understandings of art, and that will in a way transform the social contract, in the grip of which I think art museums as well as ethnographic museums and all the ways in which they reframed themselves still are. So I'm very, very happy about this presentation here. Given that we just have 30 minutes, I would like to open up the floor for discussion. But I first would like to ask the panelists whether they may have certain issues they want to ask each other about. I saw a lot of things going on in the chat, and somewhat to my surprise even, I noticed that, for example, Stephanie said, oh, how interesting to hear more about the Leiden exhibition and so on. So it seems also there is a need, even for curators who work on the same materials, to perhaps get into a deeper conversation and so on. So I wonder whether there are some points that you would like to raise with regard to each other. Otherwise, we will open up the floor for discussion.
Perhaps I can say something. Well, I also wanted to highlight, and I think that's, well, Nick mentioned it as well, and I think Stephanie did as well, that these exhibitions are always very kind of collaborative in nature. And so they would not have been possible because, well, you know, I presented it, but we really worked together with the whole team, and Erna was part of that team. And was also, well, the curator basically, but also what I really appreciated in this exhibition is that we worked with a designer who was very appreciative, I think, of what we as exhibition makers and curators wanted to say. And because often, in my experience, we have designers who are really wanting to make a personal statement, and she, Wendy Rommers is her name, she really kind of supported the themes that we wanted to address and the whole kind of feel that we wanted to get for the exhibition. And it wasn't so much about her making it this personal statement. And so as a group, I think we worked really nicely together. And also with, I also want to mention Caroline Nédé, who was really instrumental in making the interactive wall, but also in supporting all the volunteers who worked with George Nuku. And I think that's also something that is often, you know, forgotten, that if you want to have make a living exhibition, it's really important to have a good team that you know, works together and that works towards one kind of joint goal, or and also allows for these very different voices also to be heard and to be seen.
Thank you, Vono. I think it's very important to point at these collaborations. Okay, let me ask one question, especially to the Oceania curators. Why do you think was it welcomed so positively, whereas the Kirchner-Nolde exhibition in the Stedelijk, of course, also got very positive responses, but also was quite strongly criticized, let's say, from a kind of more mainstream modern art perspective. I still try to get my head around that. I also noticed that coloniality perhaps has been brought into the picture, put into the spotlight very explicitly in the Kirchner-Nolde exhibition, and perhaps was more implicit in Oceania. I don't know whether that is the case. That is an impression I have. But why and how is it that it seems that this exhibition generated so much kind of support and positive sentiments? And is it desirable, or would one not have to create some shock and also try to go where the real pain is, as it were? So I would be interested to hear your views about that. And I saw that Nick wanted to respond.
Well, I think I just wanted to say that what really drove the success of Oceania was the mana and the spirit and the power of the work in the exhibition, and also the extent to which, we were fortunate to have New Zealand government support, and they helped facilitate the visits of substantial Maori, but other Pacific delegates, so that presence was there, you know, at that time. I think it is the case that there was a critique of colonial history in it, but it was possibly, I don't think it would be right to say that it was implicit, but it was not the headline. And if it had been the headline, that might have triggered a different kind of debate.
I don't know what happens, that Stephanie is not able to unmute herself, I think.
Oh, no.
Okay.
Okay, sorry, I did not realize you gave me the the stage. No, I was just thinking when, because of course, we come back to the topic of the session, which is the difference between the art museum and the ethnographic museum,
exactly,
in the collective imagination of European museum visitors. I think in the context that I described, which is post South Savoy report, we were very much expected to talk about colonization and violence, and it was certainly enough that it was not too uncomfortable for people, and they reacted more strongly when it was a little bit uncomfortable, like with Lisa Rayana's video. But that's where it is very interesting at the same time, we are criticized quite a lot to when we present non-European art as art rather than ethnographic material. And yesterday I heard the keynote speaker saying that some of the critiques that the exhibition Kirchner and Nolde received was that it was the end of the art museum. Like there is still no really going away from those categories. Like if the art museum was not supposed to have a political positioning, which of course is not possible. Same with the ethnographic museum, and like we should not show ethnographic or non-European art as art. Actually, I think the very positive response we got was because the artwork were absolutely shockingly beautiful and people were amazed at them.
Thank you, Stephanie. I see that Beatrice wants perhaps to come in on this, and I also see that Nancy Yao has some ideas about this in the chat. So I think let's listen to Beatrice and then give the floor to Nancy if she is prepared to speak. Beatrice.
Thank you, Birgit. Yes, I was just wondering about this question that you raised, and I think what this comes down to really is the idea of the autonomy of art that is expected in the art museum, and us including the historic context and also artworks from outside of Europe doesn't seem to be acceptable in the context of the art museum, whereas ethnographic museums can exhibit contemporary art without there being any kind of criticism. So there is a different expectation there, I think. And in that context, I also have a question for the presentation. The people presented on the different Oceania venues. I only saw the one in London and in Leiden, which is really great. So I'm sorry, Stephanie, I missed the one in Paris. It looks great. But what I was wondering is, how did you take into account the different audiences that you have? Because of course, in London, it was represented in the Royal Academy, which is normally an European art space. And that you would attract a different audience there from the ethnographic museums, I would expect. I didn't see the opening in London. I did visit the exhibition. It was really beautiful. And I saw the one in Leiden as well, which is also really great. And in Leiden, I did see the opening, which is really so entirely different from the openings that we would do in the art museum. So that was also very interesting. And what I was also wondering about is that the artworks seem to be exhibited more as, or the works, or objects were exhibited more as artworks and for the aesthetic quality, less than for there wasn't really always much information about the original culture and meaning, and visitors to a museum like the Royal Academy wouldn't maybe always know a lot about the object. So I was wondering, did you take that into account, Nick, or did you think that wasn't so important?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Beatrice. So I think that Stephanie got this question, and maybe Nick also wants to speak to it. And after that, we turn to Nancy. Stephanie.
But I think Vonu also wanted to answer the
first question. No, just you got the question from Beatrice, so please.
Okay, well, we taking the different audiences into consideration is our job. So we had the classical, we had quite a lot of things dedicated to children. Of course, it's one of our mission to give the stage to communities, indigenous communities. And so we had a blessing ceremony, we had an opening, we had a closing ceremony too. And we had a special weekend of events where many artists and activists and other people from the Pacific participated, and that was really important. And in terms of information, we did have quite a lot of text in the exhibition. We worked on the labels quite a lot. It was a very important point that all the provenances would be written if we knew about them, including the historical provenances. So if the object had been collected by an expedition or something, that was written down. And of course, we did not have the only artifact that had been looted from the British Museum. So that was not a problem. We also translated and changed a little bit the audio guide so that many Pacific voices could be heard in that way too. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I think Nick and also Vodo on this issue. Nick, please.
Well, I don't think I can say too much about audiences, except that, of course, it's always a huge challenge to make an exhibition work for scholars, the people who really know the material, for the general public, for children, for the members of the diasporic community and others who are visiting. One thing, though, I think that was important was that the Royal Academy is quite distinctive in that it's basically an artist's institution. It's not a public museum, although it's a charitable foundation. The RA sort of has always run this show, which is kind of the equivalent of the Salon in France. That sort of, in a way, I mean, we could have ignored that, but it kind of mattered to us because it gave us the opportunity to foreground all the works, even the historic ones, by artists whose names we didn't know, as the works of individual artists that reflected their creativity and imagination. And I think that was important. I just wanted to sort of, this may seem a completely different point, but I think actually Narelle's talk was really important as part of the same discussion, particularly for me, because Tiwi work was the first work to be included in Australian art institutions, in the Art Gallery of New South Wales, in the 1950s. So it has a very critical place in the whole history of these engagements. All the more so, really, because it's also one of the, I mean, a kind of key location for Indigenous modernism. Diana, who she mentioned, and also Diana's predecessors as arts advisors, facilitated not only work in textiles, like the green piece actually on the sofa behind me is was given to me by a Tiwi person, but also work in print, lino cuts and so on in other media started in there in the late 60s. And I think, in a sense, if we could imagine that history also being represented in European art museums and for European publics, we would really be moving along this kind of understanding to a significant extent. It's brilliant that contemporary practitioners like Pedro are prominent through the Barcelona exhibition, but I think the many threads of these sort of local modernist histories really need to be better recognized too.
Thank you, Nick. And perhaps also by thinking back about Daniel's presentation, also see how, in a way, artists become recognized and what possibilities there are to get some support and some training and some recognition so that it is possible at all to get into the radar, as it were. Vonu also, and then really I want to give the floor to Nancy. Okay.
Yeah, and no, I will be very brief. For us, it was, of course, really difficult to really get a sense of the visitor feedback because we were open for such a short period. But what we did, what we were aware of, we really tried to, I think most people were really amazed actually at also the contemporary artwork and the interplay between the historical artwork and the contemporary art. Because in our type of museums, people often expect to see this kind of timeless display of objects. And so we really wanted to anchor works in time and in space. A second thing is that we thought it was really important also to, as I said before, to show this link of the Netherlands with the Pacific. Yeah. And that means addressing quite a difficult issue. And so we actually warned our Indonesian curator colleagues that we were having this display of photographs from Papua and West Papua, because we are really aware that if they come with Indonesian visitors, for example, that might create tensions, because we've experienced that in the past, but we didn't think that was reason enough not to address. So we thought it was really important to address it, to show it, but not in an aggressive way, and not by kind of pointing fingers at anyone, but just really telling what the situation is and addressing that issue. But we didn't actually receive, as far as I know, a criticism about that. What we did see is that because of Corona, a lot of people, when the museum reopened, a lot of the older visitors were afraid to come to the museum. And we saw that the exhibition was very popular actually with families and with children. We hadn't not really expected that, but children were very much engaged with the exhibition. And so we tried to twist it a little bit towards this family audience as well, to advertise it for that audience, because they were less afraid of coming to the museum when the museum was opened between two lockdowns.
Thank you. Thank you. This is all very helpful to get a clearer idea of the different stakeholders and audiences also you have to cater for. Okay, let us turn to Nancy. She responded already in the chat, I think also to my observation that one exhibition created perhaps less annoyed reactions than another. And you said, I think rightly so, that of course these ask different questions. Still, since we are to discuss here the differences between art museums and what their space is, and ethnographic museums and how they developed and what their space is, I think the question may be interesting. But I would be very happy, Nancy, to hear your view here and your question perhaps you want to raise for our debate.
Well, I just, hi everyone.
Hi.
Happy to see you all, first of all, enjoying these 2 days very much. And I think Beatrice already mentioned something important in relation to the question you raised, Birgit. I think it's very important, a viewer coming to a museum space already has a particular lens. And so the dominant lens is, of course, when people enter the sort of most important art museum of the Netherlands, the Stedelijk, to see art. And through that dominant lens, ethnographic art is maybe beautiful, but not considered art in the sense that European art is considered art. And so then to be confronted really with a mirroring of those two worlds and how that is expressed in art, I think was too confrontational for many viewers who, especially the more quote unquote traditional visitors of the Stedelijk, who are also somewhat older. I think it was mentioned already yesterday in maybe by Rijn or someone else, but so people really become shocked. And it's also been mentioned yesterday, people also make racist remarks like, what are these things doing together? So people's worldviews were shook in some cases, and I think that made for a successful exhibit, to be clear. And I just, as I have the floor, I just wanted to also show this little catalog, which was made 1 year before I was born, in 1966, where actually the Rijksmuseum, just 100 meters from the Stedelijk, and both these museums were also founded in the same decade in the late 19th century, which also is a particular context of, obviously, the Netherlands very much being colonial empire and Amsterdam very much being colonial empire. But this exhibit in the Rijksmuseum was there was an unexpected opportunity, but because the Rijksmuseum was working on rebuilding, and they suddenly had space to do an impromptu exhibit, if you will, and then they decided to put Papuan art there. And they say in the preface, like, the boundaries between ethnography and art has already been faded long ago. So I think it's also interesting how we have these types of conversations through the decades in the Netherlands. So I think it's also not a linear conversation. It's something that appears and disappears and reappears again. And in the current context, it's of course very interesting because of things like Black Lives Matter and race relations and conversations, public conversations about race, and our colonial past, that make also for a very different lens at the same time. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's very important to point it out so loudly and clearly. And I think that Beatrice just made a very important remark in the chat that, of course, the Stedelijk, of course, had already a show on modern art from Europe and Africa with what you call ethnographic art mixed with European art. But of course, this still raises the question how the two, even if the ethnographic things are normalized, as Lisa Hilly called it, as art, are they on an equal level? Or is there still behind this old smoke screen that separates the ethnographic from the artistic? And I think it shows that this is a lingering question we are facing, of course. And I don't know, Lisa, whether your point in the chat about the normalizing of non-European art also goes into that direction. Do you want to speak to this? I'm not sure Lisa hears it. Then I would also like, I just try to look at you, follow the discussion, and check out the check. Okay, so Lisa responded via the chat. Thank you. Also, I found the question raised by Peter Brandt very interesting. Peter, I don't know whether, no, you are not here, so I will read it. And he poses the question to Stephanie, but I think it is a more general question. Given the different museums Stephanie described with regard to Paris, would it be possible for two of them to collaborate as the Stedelijk has done? Is the collaboration working at the Stedelijk? So yes, maybe Stephanie could take that question, and Beatrice might also respond about this collaboration.
Well, yes, actually, we do have quite a few collaborations happening. Some very punctual, some more permanent. Of course, the idea that comes to mind is the Pavillon des Sessions, which is a display of Quai Branly's artifact, which is permanently housed in the Louvre. And on specific exhibitions, like we had Picasso a few years back. Of course, we had a lot of loans from other institutions. It's working, I think. But what I find very interesting with the Kirchner and Nolde exhibition, of course, is the point of view that's criticizing our sitting back in the colonial context works of art that we already know. And I think that would be something extremely interesting to do in France as well. We've had some challenging exhibition that tried to erase limiting categories such as Les Magiciens de la Terre already in the 80s. So it's definitely an intellectual landscape where it can be happening as well.
Thank you. Beatrice, you want to come in for this?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I mean, I think the collaboration is definitely working, and it's been really inspiring, and I think we can have a lot to learn from each other in that respect. Also in terms of the different approaches, and so I think it might be also a way to the future to bring the museums closer to each other.
Thank you. Very good. I see two important strands in the chat, and I think they are coming up more. I think that Erna raised a point with regard to involving Papua, also in relation to the involvement of audiences, which I think is a very interesting point. So Erna, do you briefly want to say something about that? Alas, I have to say briefly, because I would still like to get at another point the question of history in relation to museums of modern art and ethnographic museums. Anna, please.
Actually, I was just adding to what Wona had said about warning Indonesian curators, our colleagues, that we were dealing with the issue of the current struggle that is faced by people in Papua. And so a part of doing that was actually was planned that would happen through programming, and that was tours by people who had left Papua because they had to, reflecting on that history and actually telling that to a public as well. So it was sharing that story more widely, but also having the people in the first voice. So it's not us talking about them again.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Erna, for sharing this. I would also like to refer to quite a long and very already deep exchange in the chat that kicks off from a remark made by Mario Caro, who addresses this question of how, in fact, colonial history could be and should be invoked and explained in an ethnographic museum. And he also reiterated the point made by Nick Thomas that one should avoid, in a way, creating this impression of colonialism having destroyed everything. For this also fueled, in a way, this craze for collecting the very items that we find in our collections. So collecting a kind of cultural items from a world under destruction due to European colonialism. But then also Nick responded to Mario Caro's point, also stressing that, of course, there could not be one single curatorial strategy to be thought up to do justice to history, culture, or art a tradition, and emphasize that we also need history-focused exhibitions. But then Peter Pels comes in and says, well, but why would history not matter, in a way, to ethnographic museums as it would to art history museums, pursuing this point further by stressing that, of course, many people who work as curators in art museums are also art historians. So there is this big issue of history on the table. And I would be very happy if, Nick, you would say something about this. It's a huge topic, and we can only touch upon it now. Yeah.
I'd be happier if other people said more about it. But I do think, again, it's a question of audience. I mean, about the time Oceania opened, there were new galleries at the National Maritime Museum in London, which is basically a sort of a kind of museum of British naval history, I mean, also to some extent of maritime culture more broadly. I guess if I'd have been curating those, I would have approached things very differently to how we approached Oceania. But I'm also remembering actually something that Emmanuel Casafaru, his predecessor, Stéphane Martin, said in I mean, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, when a Maori exhibition that foregrounded resistance actually was rather negatively reviewed at the Kay Bronley. And he said it's important to think about a museum as being like a theatre, so that you do plays of a lot of different kinds. And I mean, if this doesn't sound too British focused, you know, in a British theatre, you would do Shakespeare, you would do Harold Pinter, you would do a pantomime for children at Christmas. And I really think our institutions should not have a sort of single voice. I think we should be doing, you know, there's still a case for a very strictly conceived art historical exhibition, especially where there's an opportunity to do an exhibition about, you know, artists who have been neglected or overlooked or not represented before. So there's nothing wrong with that, and it may be a really important thing to do. But at the same time, it's brilliant if a seemingly mainstream art museum can do something totally different. And in that context as well, I really want to sort of celebrate the program over the last decade of the Kay Bronley, which of course was sort of criticized very much for being having a sort of rather unreconstructed primitivist agenda. And whatever you may have thought of the sort of more traditional kind of permanent displays, I mean, the temporary program had, as Stephanie pointed out, these incredible, powerful exhibitions about human zoo, very interestingly also about the network around the Senghor magazine, which I've momentarily, Presence Africaine, all of these other kinds of issues. So I think we have to be committed to a diversity of registers and strategies.
Thank you, Nick. I find this a very, very important point, also in relation to the broader question about the social contract and the relation between different types of museums. And of course, reflecting upon the way in which the colonial past has affected modes of presenting, has affected the way collections are established, it needs to be brought forward. But this can be done in very, very different ways. So that is also something I gather from this discussion, which I find incredibly intriguing. We are almost reaching, in a way, the end of, or we have already, we're a bit over time, but given that the next session will only start in 2 hours, I hope that we can have some leeway here. Peter Pels has now been able to become part of the panel, which I think is very good, so that he can raise some questions in his own words without my intermediation as a chair here. So Peter, please, you have the floor.
Thanks, Birgit. It's very brief. It's a response largely to Nick's last comment about the multiplication of voices. And one thing that struck me also during the discussion about the history aspect of all museums, in effect, is that multiplication of voices always, of course, hits upon a serious material condition of all museums, given their global distribution. And that is partly that, there is a potential hierarchy of presentation between permanent and temporary exhibitions. So when you bring in the aspect of time, which is a part of having a historical consciousness, you can ask the question, to what extent varying temporary exhibitions actually change the institution as such, because the institution as such is materially founded on a location of a certain collection, on the content of that collection, the material content of that collection, and obviously also on the buildings that have been produced to house such material assets that have been collected historically. So I think that is something that you have to throw into the discussion, right? You can't just turn the Stedelijk into not an art museum or a history museum, because there is that collection. But there is somehow the duty to refigure the way we deal with that history, despite these material conditions.
Thank you, Peter, for laying out your point very clearly. You also had another point about religion that you raised, but maybe for this point, does anyone want to respond? Or shall we use it and think? Okay, then Beatrice.
Yeah, maybe just briefly. I mean, of course, we have each museum has their own collections that they have to deal with, and we have our collections, so it's natural that we deal with that mostly. But at the same time, I think, like you say, Peter, we look at it differently now, and we can give a different perspective and frame it differently, this collection. And so I think this is what was important to me in this project, is to really give a different context and highlight this historical context in a way that has not been done before. And yeah, that's
great.
Basically.
Yeah, and that I think is very important. So there is something new. Even also the Stedelijk has this history of working with art from Africa, as you pointed out. So there is something new. And I think, of course, the last word about all this cannot be said at this moment. I would like to end our discussion by bringing up a point raised by Machteld Löwenstein in the chat. And she writes, in this discussion, this is my impression, the equation European objects, art objects versus outside European ethnographic objects is being addressed. This raises for me a question on a meta level. How should the terms art and ethnographic be defined, and by whom? For what about European up until now as ethnographic qualified objects? Where do we leave those objects? I think this is also a complex question, and Lisa Hilly already has brought up this idea of normalization and the power structures in which that happens. It's indeed a big question on the meta level. I would be interested to hear who would like to take this up. Maybe also our panelists, Daniel and Narella, who really work on these issues from the art perspective. So maybe Narelle, can you start? And then I see Anna is also wishing to say something. Please unmute yourself. Please unmute.
For me, it's a very simple equation. We always talk about continuity. In the context of Australia, we talk about 60,000 years of continuous culture. And for me, to concentrate on a Tunga, for me, to find artists are continuing to produce those works. They're continuing to be used ceremonially in a very deep way, but at the same time, they're negotiating institutional context that they're being invited into. In fact, we were able to purchase a Tunga recently made by Pedro in ostensibly for an exhibition, but for a collection that isn't collecting at the moment. No, so when we talk about continuity, it was a huge step to actually incorporate a contemporary work into the context of a collection that was very significant.
Thank you. Anna.
I don't know if this helps anyone else, but I have started thinking about all of the categories that we've been thinking about as material culture and as subcategories of material culture. And actually that I find frees me up, at least, to just make an equivalence between things that doesn't have the implicit hierarchies that we usually have if we talk about art or if we talk about ethnographic objects. There's a sort of a connotation of the levels at which those things are. And I think material culture is sort of an equalizer. It also implies that we know something about the surrounding circumstances of that thing, whatever it is that we're talking about. So the history, the time, the context has to be there for it to be material culture. So that also equalizes things between art and a shadow that I've seen behind all of our conversations. I've briefly talked to Beatrice about is the idea of neutrality as well in the art museum, which seems really weird because I mean, I went to art school in the 1990s and we were already taught that you know, frames are never neutral and they're always doing something, they're active. So you need to take account of those. And yeah, to think that they're context free is a bit weird in this day and age.
No, exactly. Thank you, Anna. I think this is something we also learn, of course, even from these discussions, that a narrow understanding of art as, in a way, belonging to a kind of supposed European high ground is already very much up for deconstruction for quite some time. And then indeed the terms for including certain forms made by others are debated. But this, of course, perhaps does not mean that we have solved this whole question of what makes it that certain objects are framed as such and such. Whether, however, in the end one can just get rid of those frames and say, let's talk about material culture, is of course also a big question, certainly for a museum that is devoted to modern art, right? And yeah, there may be many reasons, including historical ones, to, of course, stick to the label and the obligations, but also the rethinking that should happen. And that is perhaps something we have really seen in the recent exhibition. One thing I get from this discussion is that I think it's incredibly important and also intriguing, also refreshing, I think, to bring curators and scholars working on these different spheres into an intense conversation. As I see this panel, I think that, well, we have explored a case. We have heard about also the questions concerning art, even what is recognized as art, how are artists in a way supported as to be able to get under what I call the radar of curators on the Pacific and so on. We have heard about an installation exhibition in the making. So I'm very, very happy about this panel. I see it as the beginning. There's much to ponder about. I saw that there was a question to be able to share the chat. I think that would be a good idea. There's just a lot of food for thought, and we could easily develop a full conference or a series of lectures or so out of it. I'm quite enthusiastic about how it went. I hope you can also share in this a little bit. I think we now are over 15 minutes over our time, so we should stop so that everyone can do some other things. And then we re-congregate here at, what was it, 1:30, right? Am I right? Okay, so thanks a lot for the presenters, for the participants, for raising the questions via the chat or here, and see you later.